So I was pleased when Bella approached me about the possibility of writing a thesis on phenomenology. I had studied with the phenomenologist Robert Sokolowski in graduate school, and although I later found my home in Thomism, phenomenology left a lasting and salutary mark on my thinking. But phenomenological texts are often not easy to read. They can be dense and difficult. But Bella worked her way through a number of them and put together an exemplary thesis. And I think we're going to reap some of the fruits of her labor today. So please join me in welcoming Bella Ramsay.
Thank you all very much for being here. And special thank you to my advisor, Dr. Shields. This project could not have happened without you. And I would not have trusted my own ideas as being anything beyond something I made up if it weren't for you affirming them. So I appreciate that. Dr. Bolin, I appreciate all of your input in our conversations. And I would often be writing things and then consider to myself, if Dr. Bolin were to argue against this, what would he say? It's very helpful. And Dr. Glenn, I'm really glad that you're my third panelist. And I know I've been seeing the ripple effect of your own enthusiasm for phenomenology. You're probably responsible for half the people in this room who are like, phenomenology sounds great. Dr. Glenn is excited. I don't know what it is. So I'm glad you're here. Let's begin with an invocation to Our Lady Seat of Wisdom, especially as she is our example of humility when it comes to the pursuit of wisdom. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Yesterday, our own dear Father Deacon, President Dr. Probatus Kyle Washett, told us all that we were fortunate to be able to be here this week. Because every oration you go to, then the orator is giving you a gift. And I love that way of thinking about speeches. And hopefully we all think about speeches in this manner. Unfortunately, not everybody does. Now, there's this one man who I don't think would ever have been invited to lecture at Wyoming Catholic College. But if he had, he might have said something similar to the speech he gave at some college in France in 1970s. He writes language. The performance of a language system is neither reactionary nor progressive. It is quite simply fascist. He goes on to explain that what he's saying by this is a sort of words are power thing. That there's no explicit meaning to the words that we say. They don't actually express any truth within them, but rather it's only the assertion of one will over the other. What this is getting at is a metaphysical underpinning that says reality is unintelligible and language is for the sake of power. Language is not in service of truth. Hopefully by the end of this oration, then we have a reason to say that reality actually is intelligible and language actually is in the service of truth. In order to do this, though, we're going to have to get kind of deep into the weeds. We have to begin, though, where we are born. This is how Socrates begins his own philosophy. And in the Republic, then it's illustrated that you are first born into a cave with images that you are looking at. You do not know the reality of things because it's been gifted to you as you are born. Instead, you grow, you are educated, you learn. But first you must recognize if you are in a cave. So for us, for modern man, are we in a cave? And if we are, what does that cave look like? You can turn to your next quote. This is the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. He's writing about where existentialism came from. Our point of departure is the subjectivity of the individual. At the point of departure, there cannot be any other truth than this. I think, therefore I am, which is the absolute truth of consciousness as it attains to itself. The absolute truth of consciousness as it attains to itself. Being, I think, therefore I am, which was the declaration that Descartes made in the 1600s to begin his own philosophy. So Sartre, who is considered in some sense the father of modern existentialism, with all of those elements within it, is pointing towards Descartes as saying this is our origin. And specifically, the origin is that of a denial of an objectivity that you begin with, and instead a subjectivity, the subjectivity of the individual. I believe that the cave that all of us are born into is this cultural climate, which is affected by the philosophy that begins with the subjectivity of the individual, specifically as it has come downstream to us from Descartes. Okay, we have a big project in front of us. To begin with, I'm going to talk to you about the trap that we are currently engaged in. And my title is called The Cartesian Trap, but I'm going to be speaking about it as the egocentric predicament. Secondly, once we are aware of this problem, we can actually look at its origins. Where did it come from? How did we get here? And if we're able to see the origins, if we're able to see our enemy for what it truly is, then hopefully there is a way of return. That there is a way of return for a people who is inclined to begin philosophy with the subjectivity of the individual. And then we'll look at some of the impacts of that return too. So what is egocentrism? What is the egocentric predicament? Egocentrism is a term, at least how I'm applying it, that only belongs to epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. But since I assume most of us are not epistemologists in this room, could be wrong, I'm going to begin with a science that's a little bit more familiar with us, that of physics and astronomy. Now, in physics and astronomy, there is this debate in the 17th century of what the universe actually looks like. What model of the universe should we accept? A geocentric model or a heliocentric model? The heliocentric model put the sun at the center, and the geocentric model put the earth at the center, and said that the earth is the point around which the rest of the knowable reality, the rest of physical reality, that is, revolves. Therefore, for a geocentric, in order to engage in the sciences of a physical or astronomical nature, you would first have to look at the perspective of the earth and then work out from there, because that's the center. This is a geocentric model. The egocentric model isn't looking at physical reality. Rather, it expands that set to include all knowable reality, just the world itself. So that would also mean anything that possibly could come into reality, anything that possibly could be known. But within this world, the egocentric model says at the very center is the ego, the individual thinking self, or for Sartre, consciousness as it attains to itself. So there's our own individual ego that is at the center of this entire model. What that means is the rest of intelligible reality can only be known through the perspective of that individual. Why is this a problem? Why should we care? Robert Sokolowski, in your next quote, had said, "The Cartesian predicament is the unfortunate situation within which modern philosophy must begin." Okay, that's great. And then it says, "Our consciousness, first and foremost, is not of anything at all. Rather, we are caught in what has been called an egocentric predicament. All we can really be sure of at the start is our own conscious existence and the states of that consciousness." What Sokolowski is saying here is it's not just an egocentric model, but rather, if you have a model of reality that begins with the ego, that begins with the subjective reality, consciousness as it attains to itself, the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, it never gets beyond itself. You become stuck. It's a Cartesian trap. You're stuck inside your head. Sokolowski continues, "I once heard a famous brain scientist say in a lecture, almost tearfully, that after so many years of studying the brain, he still could not explain how that avocado-colored organ inside our skulls could get beyond itself and reach out into the world." Now here, Sokolowski is quoting a brain scientist, not, after all, an epistemologist. But isn't that kind of the point about philosophy? And wasn't that kind of the point about the geocentric debate? It does not just end within its own sciences, but the models from which we view all of reality are going to affect all of our other sciences. So that's what the egocentric predicament is. What happened? How did we get to this point? Now we can return to the Cartesian I think, therefore I am, the point that Sartre highlights as where we departed from. Now, I like to visualize this as a sort of prism. And at the point when Descartes decided to say, I think, therefore I am, there's a sort of refracting effect on all the light that had been coming in. Previously, we had allowed metaphysics to be kind of the highlight and the crown of philosophy. But after Descartes, instead of there simply being one science that all of the sciences hoped to converge at, and instead refracted out into so many different directions. Some of these being the physiology, neurology, and psychology of people like the scientists that Sokolowski was quoting. So it's a big effect, not just on epistemology, but also in our individual lives. It shouldn't be hard to enter into Cartesian philosophy. This is our next task. It shouldn't be hard to enter into Cartesian philosophy because I've already claimed that we're all somewhat Cartesian. All the same, just to be sure and certain that we are in the headspace that we need to be in for my argument, I'm going to make us all engage in an imaginative exercise as a sort of streamlining of experience. So I need you all to trust me enough to close your eyes right now. Colia, you too. Great. Now I want you to place yourself inside a small enclosed room. It could be your bedroom. It can be a little cabin you visited once upon a time. And I want you to situate yourself in the center of that room, seated upon a wooden stool. Very good. Then you should only have one source of light in that room, and preferably it's a natural light. So a fireplace or a candle, something like that. Now, one by one, remove all the details of the room. Remove the flickering fireplace. Remove the stool you are sitting upon until you're only conscious of yourself. At this point, you're allowed to be Descartes and say, I think, therefore I am. You're aware of your own consciousness, and you are not aware of the world around it. Okay, you can open your eyes now. It's nice, right? Nobody fell asleep? Wow. Okay, so this is a sort of format that Descartes is thinking within, an imaginative experiment. But we want to understand Descartes' philosophy in its entirety. We want to have a comprehensive view of what Descartes was saying, what his project was, what he was hoping to attain, in order to understand why it was so problematic to our modern psyche. We can understand Cartesian thought according to three different aspects. We can understand it according to its method, according to its content, and according to its scope. Before we do this, however, I want to present you with two separate images. With Descartes' philosophy, we're going to see a pattern of thought that is generally focused upon the self. Hopefully, by the time I finally get to phenomenology, then we will see a pattern of thinking that brings you beyond the self. Just that we are aware of the different paths that we're going to go so that you're not massively uncomfortable when we get to the end of Cartesian thought, I want you to look at two opposing images. The first one is from the Roman poet Ovid, and he was narrating about a boy, Narcissus. This was a beautiful, strapping young Greek lad. Now, Narcissus was so gorgeous, in fact, that whenever somebody would see him, they would fall in love, but he wouldn't have any of it. He wouldn't choose anybody to love himself. One day, however, he was on a solo stroll into the woods, something we're all familiar with, and he came upon a shining body of water. Now, as he looked down into that water, then he saw himself gazing back. He was struck by his own reflection and by the beauty within it. So he stands transfixed, gazing at his own reflection. But then he never leaves. In fact, he stays there until he eventually dies of starvation and withers away. So within Ovid's story of Narcissus, then there is this self-obsession. Gazing at the reflection of the self can lead to self-destruction. It can make it so that there is no reality beyond the self. It can make it so that you're so stuck that you destroy yourself. That's one potential path if you look at the reflection of yourself. There is, however, an alternative also present in the classical tradition. St. Augustine, writing about half a century after Ovid, begins his confessions with reflections upon his own life, starting with his infancy and then moving himself along. And as he dives into all of these memories, all of these experiences that he had, as he dives into even questions of who am I, what is a thinking self, these kinds of questions, eventually, by the end of the work, he is reflecting upon such lofty subjects as time itself and memory and eternity. He even has a glimpse of the divine. St. Augustine also was looking at a reflection of himself, but he was able to do it in such a way that there was an ascent to wisdom, that he was drawn beyond the self towards something more true than the self. So it seems to us, if modern philosophy is beginning with the subjectivity of the self, there are two potential paths. We may either go the route of narcissistic self-obsession and die, I guess, or we could also potentially, perhaps, at least theoretically, go the path of an Augustinian ascent to wisdom. Modern philosophy is not entirely doomed. Okay, but Cartesian philosophy is, and let's look at why. So what is the method of Cartesian philosophy? Method is something that is essential to Descartes. So much so that he spends his first 3 parts within his discourse on methods just going into the method, the way that he actually gets to it. And it's called Discourse on Method. So this method, you can see in your next quote. I thought it necessary that I reject as absolutely false anything in which I could imagine the least doubt, end quote. And what does this include? This even includes his own body. I could pretend that I had no body and that there was no world nor any place where I was. I could not pretend that I did not exist at all, end quote. Okay, so that exercise where we placed ourselves in the room, Descartes is saying that he could imagine, he could doubt the existence of anything besides that very last awareness that we had. So we can doubt the fact that the fire exists, doubt that he's in a room, doubt his own body, doubt his senses, but you cannot doubt his own consciousness. Specifically what Sartre would call consciousness as it attains to itself. Okay, and then we get the content of Cartesian thought, and this is supposed to be the foundation to his entire science. So this is like revelatory, right? This is the good stuff of Cartesian thought. I think, therefore I am. Yeah. And then he attempts, this is his scope, to build a new metaphysics upon that foundation, upon the foundation of his own thinking thought. So what then is thought, you ask yourself? Well, for Descartes, it was just everything that he is able to do, basically. So again, it points back to himself. And who is he? I am a thinking self. So it points back to thought. We see here that he's caught in a circle. It's as if it's a young Greek boy narcissist looking at his own reflection and seeing answering glances of love, as Ovid puts it, and being so entranced by those answering glances of love that he shares with them. But it's an ongoing cycle. It's a destructive loop. Nobody's going to get out of that. Okay. Descartes' project kind of worked, at least halfway. It worked in what he said was the first part, which was to destroy old metaphysics. I had to get rid of those previous opinions in order to build upon it a sure science. But the new science that he built, as we have seen, is of itself destructive. It cannot get to truth beyond itself. So then, let's avoid the narcissism. How can we retain the subjectivity of the individual and yet not be stuck in the Cartesian egocentric predicament? This is when I can finally introduce phenomenology. The phenomenology that I have been reading for the most part is from Edmund Husserl, who was writing about the turn of the 20th century. And Husserl's phenomenology is in some ways a direct response to Descartes' philosophy. But it also, in order to work, has to be seen according to its method and its content and its scope. So let's begin with the method of phenomenology. This is Husserl's introduction to his work, and you'll get a taste of what it's like to read these German philosophers. What makes the appropriation of the essential nature of phenomenology so extraordinarily difficult is that in addition to all other adjustments, a new way of looking at things is necessary, one that contrasts at every point with the natural attitude of experience and thought. So this is a new thing. Thankfully for us, though, it's not so difficult since we've already engaged in that imaginative exercise. So Husserl here is saying that there's a new attitude and it contrasts with the natural attitude. So let's know what the natural attitude is, and maybe we can figure out what the phenomenological one is. In your next quote, this is the natural attitude. I'm aware of a world spread out in space endlessly and in time becoming and become without end. I'm aware of it. That means, first of all, I discover it immediately, intuitively, I experience it. Okay. Before I asked you to engage in that imaginative exercise, you were sitting in this room. Oh, and look, you still are. Just by nature of the people that we are, then we are in a certain place and we have experiences. The influx of those experiences pre-reflexively is what Husserl means by the natural attitude. He emphasizes it in the next quote. Our first outlook upon life is that of natural human beings, imaging, judging, feeling, willing from the natural standpoint. So this is the general foundation for thought, the experiences that just come to you. What then is the phenomenological attitude? This is Sokolowski attempting to consolidate Husserl's explanation, because Husserl's explanation is a little bit harder to grasp. So there are some defaults to this one, there's some defects to this one, but we're going to go with Sokolowski's. The phenomenological attitude is the focus we have when we reflect upon the natural attitude and all the intentionalities that occur within it. Sokolowski is describing this new attitude, the one that Husserl is speaking of, that contrasts with the natural standpoint, as being a sort of reflection, as being a removal from the natural standpoint, not in the sense that you reject it or doubt it, as Descartes did, but instead that you go beyond it. I was able to think of 3 images that might potentially help us with that. The first is if you've read if you've read The Tempest, have you read Shakespeare? Then he has Prospero in The Tempest as kind of moving pieces within the play. And so Prospero is a part of the story, but he's kind of removed from the story as well, because he is in some ways beyond the narrative. So that would be some kind of detachment from the story, even while being a part of it. Another way you could think about it is, if you're more into politics than in humanities, then Socrates within the city of Athens would do a certain kind of philosophy, but for the most part, it was just discourse about politics and discourse about opinions. But then in order to do some of his heavy lifting, like for the Republic, then he would actually step outside of the city and then philosophize about the city from beyond the city. So there had to be a sort of removal from the political sphere in order to understand about the political sphere. And then perhaps a third way we could understand it is for the mathematicians, not myself. Then even though you have to begin math using natural numbers and kind of understand the operations within that sphere, at some point when you have advanced enough mathematics, you're jumping fields. But if you do that, you can't just add the natural numbers. You can't just be mixing natural numbers and complex numbers and performing the same operations on them. There actually has to be a sort of transference, a transformation that occurs to your natural numbers before they enter into the new field. So the same thing is happening for philosophy, right? You have all of these things in the natural standpoint. You have all of your experiences, but then they undergo a transformation in order to be reflected upon in the phenomenological attitude. Yes. There is an impact to all of this, and it does apply to Descartes. Your next quote is Sokolowski again. We have to step outside natural convictions and without rejecting them, think about them as natural convictions if we are to do philosophy. And he means phenomenology here. Sokolowski is saying that those convictions within the natural attitude, which have been previously outlined as imaging, judging, feeling, and willing, you have to step beyond them. So the only one there that's actually a conviction is that of judging. So in other words, you must refrain from making judgments when you are in the phenomenological attitude. When I asked you to situate yourself in a room and then imagine that the fire disappeared, that the stool disappeared, I did not tell you to reject their existence. When Descartes asks us to situate ourselves into a room and then strip away the fire and the stool in our bodies, he asks us to reject them. He asks us to doubt them. He is asking us to do something contrary to our nature, contrary to our experiences. And this is a key difference between the method of the phenomenologist and that of a Cartesian. Okay, so that's the method. What is the content? Descartes' content was quite simply, I think, therefore I am. I think there should be an end to that. I do think something. I think about things. And Descartes failed to tell us anything about the nature of thought being something that points beyond itself. Phenomenology actually asks us about the nature of thought, of all thought taken together in a single bracket. And what it comes to is a core doctrine that Sokolowski posits. The core doctrine in phenomenology is the teaching that every act of consciousness we perform, every experience that we have is intentional. It is essentially consciousness of, or an experience of something or other. You can think about this as a sort of pointing. Most of our thoughts, our intentional thoughts at any rate, are not about ourselves, and they're not self-subsisting. Rather, they point beyond themselves to their objects. Even if I were to reflect upon myself, then myself taken as reflection is an object to the person who is reflecting. So no matter what you are thinking, it has to point beyond itself. Even a thought about the self is going to point beyond the self. Okay. Descartes' philosophy brought us somehow to the opinion that language is meaningless. That language does not point to realities, but instead is a sort of fascism, simply a performance, a structure that we make in order to trick or manipulate people according to our whims. Your next quote has kind of one of the places that this problem is showing itself. Were I perchance to look out my window and observe men crossing the street, I would ordinarily say I see men themselves. But what do I see aside from hats and clothes, which could conceal automata? Yet I judge them to be men. Descartes believes he is not able to say accurately, I see people. This should make us question his philosophy. Instead, in order to say I see people, he has to make a judgment. He has to have an active assertion declaring them to be people. From this, we get that little link between Barthes's opinion and Descartes' philosophy. We forget that all speech is a classification and that all classifications are oppressive. If you must begin with the ego and then declare things into existence, speech would merely be classification. It doesn't point to things beyond itself. It is in no way meaningful. It is not of its nature full of meaning. On the other hand, even from the little that we have discovered about phenomenology, simply one tenet, that of intentionality, and the method, that is the phenomenological attitude, then we can come to a conclusion about language. We can say that it actually points to things themselves, which means that of its essence, it is both teleological and holds in itself meaning. If you look at your next quote, Sokolowski makes this connection. Human speech, therefore, is directed towards things in their intelligibility, and human reason is ordered towards truth as its end and perfection. This brings us to the conclusion about the content of phenomenology. But something must be said about the scope. What is phenomenology itself for the sake of? In his preface, Husserl says this: under the title, A Pure or Transcendental Phenomenology, the work here presented seeks to found a new science. Though indeed, the whole course of philosophical development since Descartes has been preparing the way for it. A science covering a new field of experience, exclusively its own, that of transcendental subjectivity. Phenomenology is not merely supposed to be a response to Descartes. It also is supposed to open us up to us new doors in order to discover things that are transcendental subjectivity. It gives us a way of talking about the world in a more and more accurate manner, revealing more and more about the depths of things. However, for the purpose of this oration, I at least want it to be pointed out that phenomenology is a specific science that is particularly suited to modern man as an in-between before we can know metaphysical realities. Before you're able to understand the truth about things, you must have some degree of trust. And we all have trust issues. And it's because of Descartes. So I'm going to leave you with that image of Narcissus gazing at himself and St. Augustine in an eventual ascent to wisdom. One of those was truly doing philosophy. The other one was merely gazing inwards. The Delphic oracle, or the Delphic maxim from the Delphic oracle, is know thyself. And it is this beginning of Western philosophy when Socrates takes that maxim and actually applies it to his daily life. Knowing thyself for Socrates did not mean to refrain from discourse. It meant quite the opposite. It meant that he began to trust language, to trust his neighbors, and to trust that truth is something that we are coming to with slow and sure steps. Thank you.
Okay, we'll start with questions from the panel.
Oh, thank you, Bella. That was very interesting. I have a kind of puzzling thought here about the difference between what you had us do with that room.
Yeah.
By the way, when you removed the stool, I fell on the floor.
Yeah.
I forgot you forgot to remove it. What's the difference between that kind of pretending and what Descartes is saying? He's saying, I could pretend that I had no body and there was no world, any place where I was.
Yeah.
But I couldn't pretend that I wasn't the one thinking or doubting. Why is it that Descartes' pretense in that direction is more consequential than the one you had us go through? In other words, what is that? Is he actually asking us to really doubt the existence of the world? Or is there some attitude toward it that he's asking us to adopt? That's where my puzzle is. I'm not quite sure why you make as radical a claim as you do about it.
Yeah. Okay. About Descartes, you mean in particular? Yeah, that's great. I think for Descartes, he doesn't realize what he has done. Like, I think if Descartes were to have read even Kant, but most certainly like post-Kantian thinkers, definitely Nietzsche, he would have read them and been very taken aback. And even Sartre and man is something that makes himself. Like, Descartes would have looked at that and said, no, thank you. He actually wanted his metaphysics to immediately jump to the existence of God and the existence of a soul and an intelligible reality. He wanted us to be able to trust our senses. So his project was to come to a certain knowledge, and then from that build these other realities. And so it's other thinkers. I just want to point that out because I think that's like an important preliminary. It's the other thinkers that bring us to eventually the language is fascist conclusion, not Descartes himself. But Husserl actually responds basically exactly to that question, where he says, he does the same thing I just did, where he tries to kind of be nice to Descartes. He says, universal doubt is actually impossible. It is actually impossible to doubt the world about us. We always have we must have a space that we exist in. So our existence has as a corollary, a necessary corollary, are the stuff that's not our existence, like the world. For Descartes, that was God, which doesn't really make sense. But Husserl does say you can't attempt to doubt everything, though. And that's what Descartes does.
Yeah, I would wonder whether Descartes' move, is when he claims that the soul is entirely other than the body. It does. There's no sharing there. It just sort of occupies something there, not as a pilot. He even puzzles over the correct metaphor for it. But why? Why is that process of doubting, why does that lead him to the conclusion that the soul is absolutely other than, the body, and therefore of the world, right, of the natural world? And that seems like a key movement. I'm not quite sure how he gets there from pretending,
Yeah. There are different directions I could go with this. I would say the phenomenologist attempts to take all of those experiences as they are. And it doesn't tweak them, except that they are transcendentally reduced to get into the phenomenological attitude. But he doesn't change how they were given to you. Descartes had to have changed that experience as it was given to him, because as we all did it, we were still bodies in a room, And like the stool, if it had ceased to exist, you would have fallen to the ground. So Descartes was not in the phenomenological attitude. He had actually rejected the physical space that his body was in. He had changed those experiences as they had been present to him. And they had undergone a modification that's not proper to the phenomenologist because he had doubted their existence. Yeah.
Okay,
I think that's what happened.
Thanks, Mel. That was delightful. If somewhat fascist, there was a lot of language there. I also want to ask about Descartes.
Okay.
I agree with you that it seems crazy to say that we can't say we see people.
Yeah.
Because obviously we do. Some of us might even see dead people. But in that quotation, I'm curious if you could say what exactly is wrong with his reasoning. Like, what is his underlying reasoning? What exactly is wrong with it?
Yes, that's very good. I go into this in my thesis. Yeah. The simplest answer, you probably will pry deeper than this, is there's no perception, right? So an Aristotelian view of seeing things, and this is also true for the phenomenologist, is there's a recognition at some point where you can see finally, oh, that's that thing. That's that thing. You see an identity. Yeah. But for Descartes, then he says hats and clothes. What he really means is like colors and shapes. The actual sensations. And it's kind of a materialistic, I think, view of those sensations. And then from there, he says, well, then where does my mind come into play? And he's already got that mind-body split going on. So where does my mind come into play? And he goes, oh, it must be once it recognizes that they are something besides just colors and shapes. So what could it say except, oh, they're people? But now he's made it be an active assertion that there are people. Is this answering your question?
Well, I guess whether or not Descartes specifically actually means something like colors and shapes, and it's not clear why he couldn't make the move to that.
Yeah.
I could see someone making the argument in exactly more like the words he does, where they say, well, if what I'm seeing are clothes and a hat, and I can't really see even the appearance of a person, maybe I'm seeing from behind or something like that, right?
Right.
It could be a robot or something like that, which is kind of literally what he says, right?
Yeah.
What would be wrong with that reasoning to say that because it could be that, therefore I can't say it's a person?
Because manifestations are manifesting something. This is how the phenomenologist would talk, but there's actually an identity.
How do I know it's not manifesting the automaton rather than the human being?
Oh, yeah, that would require experimentation. That would require more experiences and intuitions. Basically, there is a sort of scientific method going on, right? I use the example of in Ray Bradbury. Then there was Mildred, Ray Bradbury's wife, who is looking at a television screen, and she says that they're people. She says, my family is people. She's incorrect, and Descartes is correct, right? But the philosophers or the phenomenologist here is asking, how would you know? How would you discern between those? With Descartes, you don't even have a tool to go and check, right? Both of them are correct because they both declared people, right? Mm-hmm. But for somebody who's actually believes that reality is intelligible, who just takes that as a given, then they could have modes of verification. And you'd have to come up with what that is. Like maybe you have a robot test for the automata, and like if it passes it.
Yeah, I guess, okay, that's helpful. Do you think it'd be reasonable or unreasonable if I were to say, well, even if I concede that it could be an automaton and I would need to do further investigation to find out which it is, I can still say it's a man without doing that investigation.
What's the question here?
Well, whether I could simultaneously say, I could be mistaken about this, but nonetheless, it's reasonable for me to say that this is the way it is.
Yeah. No, you actually should do that, right? Because then it's at least out there and other people can correct it. Mm-hmm. And that's been the project of philosophy in so many ways. Because people have wrong opinions. Plato was not correct in a lot of things, but he's very good for philosophy. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, that's good for now.
Okay,
thanks.
I was wondering if you could say more about what it means that every act of consciousness, every experience we have is intentional, and how that gets us out of the egocentric predicament.
Yes, that is great. So by intentional, there are so many, the way that I mentioned it in my oration was that it's a pointing, right? You're pointing towards something. But another way you could consider it is thought in itself, in some way, does not belong to the thinker, but belongs to the object. If I just say, and words are like this, so maybe it's easier to understand with words, and philosophy in some ways an extension of what's happening with language. It's easy to understand that words are signs. They also stand alone, and sometimes we want to divorce that fact so that the words just stand alone and they're not signs and they don't have meanings. And that was Nietzsche's kind of like art of language. And language is an art. That's more complex than I want to get into or that I know about. But yeah. So words in themselves are signifying things. Thought, our rationality, like there's actually a very real way in which our use of language and our rationality are linked. Our rationality itself is acting as words act, which is that it points towards objects, towards things. A thought does not arise in, in the way that it arises in us, it doesn't arise in dogs, but even dogs, we can see that they have intentional acts. That if a dog is hungry for a bone and I give them like a squeaky toy, they're still hungry for that bone. That was an intentional act. That hunger was an intentional act. It was directed towards something. And so the way that Descartes was considering thought, thinking about thought, then he denied that it was pointing towards something else. He wanted it to be self-subsistent. But from our experience, that's just not how we are rational creatures. Like simply being able to make judgments of itself without saying that thought puts us in a sort of relationality with the world, which is what intentionality means, that our thought is relational to an object, a real object, then there's no meaning behind our thoughts. It's a meaningless word, and it's hardly a word at all. It's just kind of nonsense.
It might help to distinguish this kind of intentionality from what we mean when we're willing something.
That's good.
What you're describing is simply that there's something over against us that we are aware of or conscious of.
Yeah. Do you mean when we say intentional and we mean like as in that was on purpose?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
not what this is about.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so Descartes was treating, you're saying, thoughts as if it's like self-contained,
yes.
not a thought about something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, can you, can you say how or whether the recognition that thoughts are intentional, does that prove that there is a world outside our heads? In a way that Descartes couldn't, or what is that?
No, actually, yeah. This was really cool because it got into the question of, do we need metaphysics? Is phenomenology trying to replace metaphysics? And it's not. But how Husserl saw it was phenomenology has to be a descriptive science, which means it actually isn't proving stuff about our thoughts. Descartes was trying to prove stuff about the existence of the world. If a phenomenologist says, I can prove the existence of the world, you should call them out on that because they can't, right? Instead, the phenomenologist has a new way of looking. He has a noticing that Descartes was unable to achieve, and he sees that the world is real. He recognizes that the world is real. And he recognizes also that that perception is something that's shared, not just with himself, but with all of his neighbors. But he doesn't prove it. And really, he can never prove it. Yeah.
Okay, so he's just showing that the mode of thinking in which Descartes was engaging is just not how thoughts work.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's not how the world is. Yeah.
Okay, let's open it up to audience questions.
Gosh. Just start with my sister. Philomena.
So I was just wondering if you could say more about the last bit of your oration.
Yeah.
You talked about Socrates knowing himself, and explain a little further how his trusting other people and dialoguing was him knowing himself.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why when I misspoke and said Delphic Oracle, it's because that was another line of thought that kind of gets to the same conclusion. Socrates, well, he had the Delphic maxim. It's not like that was the only Delphic maxim. There were a lot of them. But in some ways, he took that one particularly to heart because it shows up in some of his dialogues, especially in Xenophon's accounts of Socrates. But how the Delphic Oracle story goes, I think this is in the Apology, then he hears like that he's the smartest guy, basically. There's no man in Athens as wise as you. And he sets out to prove that wrong. And so that's the self-knowledge that Socrates embarks on in a large way. Also, though, when he is in, I think it's in the Phaedrus, then he engages in a dialogue where he is attempting to show that knowledge of oneself should lead to wisdom and should be philosophy. And then also, if Socrates is right in the Apology, his entire life has been a pursuit of this wisdom, a pursuit of the proving the Delphic Oracle wrong. But the way that he did this, the way that he engaged in that was all of his dialogues in Athens. Yeah. Teresa?
Okay, I'm curious. Okay, first thing, just so you know what I'm aiming towards, I would like to hear the phenomenologist's case against lying.
Lying against lying.
And here's where it comes from.
Oh, no.
So, it's kind of the heart of what you're arguing when you talk about language is the fact that we all exist in the same world and experience it equivalently. And what happens if I tell you I'm not an augur right now? What's going on and why is that?
That is a huge deal. Yeah, that's a huge deal, Teresa. Don't say that. Okay, this is why I love phenomenology so much, is because it takes things that are kind of intuitive or that you kind of hear, and then it blows them up. So you're looking at them from all these different aspects, and it becomes like way more of much more import than you initially thought. So it just dives into the details of something really tiny. So lying, yes, this is a phenomenon. This is something that phenomenology could study. And what's so interesting is the direction that phenomenology has taken is often linked with personalism. And John Paul II is generally the person Catholics know, like, oh, phenomenology, John Paul II. And arguing towards the dignity of the human person. Well, why would you get there from something that was initially responding to Descartes, right? It's because if words have meaning, then anytime I'm speaking to somebody, that's in itself a huge deal, right? Because that's not merely an exchange of information. It's not something fascist. And it's also not merely an exchange of information, which is how we often think about it. Because like if I just look something up on the internet and read it, there's no connection there. That's just an exchange of information. But if I'm actually discussing it with somebody, then we are engaged in interpersonal acts right there. And we are present and every process is present. Maybe it's elsewhere, but at least in theory, we could be totally present to one another. In heaven we will be. And so then if I find the need to say something out loud, then that means that I am with that person. And it's like how C.S. Lewis talks about friendships where you're looking at something beautiful together. Both of us have turned our beings towards that same thing together to notice something true about reality. Now we're both oriented towards a truth about reality, and it's a different one. And so we are engaged in this like really weird thing where we're like both seeing it and we're both revealing it to one another. And we're both going like deeper into what it actually is and able to know it in its fuller reality. Okay, but then what if one person were to like say, look at this, I don't know, look at this wedding ring, and it's not a wedding ring, I wasn't actually married. Then I've asked us to like look and turn towards this reality, but it's one that I've constructed. That would be kind of fascist. Yeah, it's really messed up. Yes.
Thanks, Bella. I was wondering if you could expand upon the cave analogy, especially in how it relates to phenomenology. Because if the cave is kind of like you're born into this like cultural background that's like represents you, or you're kind of the culture is presented as the cave. I think it's kind of how you explained it. but then trust is a big part of phenomenology.
Yes.
And wanting to like trust reality. I was just wondering if you could tease that out a little.
That's really interesting, actually. Yeah. The analogy of the cave wouldn't work if there was no way out of the cave. I think would be the best way to say that. Like, if there was legitimately just a stone rolled in front of it and nobody is able to push it away and you're legitimately trapped, then there would be no point in anybody trying to embark on this heroic journey. And so there is kind of this underlying premise, right? That there is a truth that you can get out of the cave. And so for us, what that means in terms of like, well, honestly, to make it a little bit more hopefully close to home, like as Catholics, and also as like most of us have studied metaphysics, or will at any rate, then we have this belief that there is truth and that we can get to it. And yet it doesn't negate the fact that we live in a post-Cartesian world. And so I think the fact that I have a belief, like a personal belief, that there is a door outside of a post-Cartesian world, is a necessary part of it. And I don't think that just comes from like, oh, it's a Christian faith. Like, you must be a Christian if you are to get out and like believe in truth. No, I'm talking about in like a bigger sense. You actually believe that philosophy has a final end. Like, philosophy is for the sake of something. It's for the sake of truth. So yeah. Yes, Asia.
Thank you, Bella. This was great. I was wondering if you could talk about the imagination a little bit more. If the imagination has the ability to give us a false sense of reality, like, what role should the imagination play in the phenomenologist's approach to reality? And is that related to transcendental reduction, or like, how is the phenomenologist supposed to use the imagination?
I haven't thought about that. The phenomenologist is going to make use of the imagination. I can say that. And he will make more use of it than your Cartesian philosopher, actually, surprisingly. And I think that's because there's a sense if the phenomenologist has kind of taken the route that Husserl takes, which eventually leads to man's rationality is for the sake of truth, is in service of truth even. Sokolowski describes it as we are agents of truth. He says the transcendental ego, which is the ego that you are able to take note of when you achieve the transcendental reduction. The transcendental ego is an agent of truth, which means like we are, just as our thoughts are pointers towards reality, our beings are pointers towards truth, at least in terms of our rational beings. And so that would mean that the phenomenologist would trust that his imagination is a tool to get to the truth. He won't initially see it as bad. And some philosophers definitely do see it as bad. So I think that would be a real way that he could use his imagination. Yeah. Yes, Scolia.
Thank you, Bella. My question was just about the way you were using Augustine as an example in his Confessions.
Yeah.
So were you suggesting that Augustine's sort of mode of philosophizing in the Confessions is the phenomenological mode?
Yes, I was suggesting that.
Okay. Could you maybe say a little bit more then about how you're seeing him doing phenomenology?
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't made that argument. It occurred to me while I was backpacking and was with an Augustinian. And I was like, whoa, that's insane. Let's hide that. And then I heard that I forget who it is. It might've been Damien Walsh's father, actually, at University of Dallas, who writes on this subject. And he actually posits that St. Augustine was doing phenomenology and was a phenomenologist. So that is fascinating in itself. I think that there is a sense that I wouldn't say St. Augustine is doing Husserlian phenomenology exactly. And so maybe you'd want to engage in a larger conversation to figure out exactly what Augustine was doing. But insofar as he begins with a sort of subjective starting point, and his own lived experience, and that for him is trustworthy. especially for this kind of like broken man in a lot of ways. I think we can all relate to Augustine in that sense, especially of like, I've made a joke about trust issues, but we actually do have trust issues. And at least you can know stuff from the innermost part of your being, right? And that's St. Augustine trusted that, even when he didn't trust other things to get him to truth. Yeah. Yes, Mozzie.
Thanks very much. So you kind of clearly shown how phenomenology is different than Cartesianism.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, is it also different than like Aristotelianism, which kind of seems to see reality in the object and I apprehend that reality, while Cartesianism is like I put reality into it in a way, like it's this extrinsic and intrinsic thing. And it's like, is phenomenology somewhere in between the two? Does it take aspects of both? And I suppose kind of a further question from that is like, is phenomenology a philosophy itself?
That's really good. Yeah. Phenomenology is a philosophy in itself, I say. But that's with sort of caveats. It is a branch, is how I like to put it, of higher philosophy. Robert Sokolowski in Introduction to Phenomenology kind of seems to say that it is metaphysics at parts. I don't know the man, maybe that's not exactly what he meant, but that's what he seems to be saying in his work, is that philosophy and phenomenology can be used interchangeably. And so that it's actually, phenomenology was a response to whatever the Cartesians were doing, which was maybe a sort of like trying to make philosophy into a science like math or something like that. Or psychology. He was definitely responding to psychologism. So some people do take that position that phenomenology is just philosophy properly done, basically. I think there's more substance to it than that. And how I view it is that it's actually kind of belongs to epistemology, the study of knowledge, and that for us in particular, it's a pointer towards metaphysics. That if you begin with subjectivity, you can't throw somebody Aquinas or throw even like the 10 categories to them, because they don't trust the world around them as much as they trust their inner life. And so I see that as being a key distinction. But if it's a philosophy, if it's like this structural system that's built upon your subjective life, then it can't become more than what it is, right? It can't be greater than its foundations. Like the teacher can't be greater than its master. And so it will fall short of metaphysics, and actually fall quite short. And Husserl says that it is, what does he say? He says that it can never be dogmatic and it must be just descriptive as a philosophy. And so that would be a key difference. So I would never just feed my children phenomenology and be like, hooray, there's your philosophy education. I think it's more medicinal than that, and opens up its own new field out of transcendental subjectivity. But that's not all we are as human beings. So we do need Aristotelian philosophy too.
Yeah, so I suppose is like, was phenomenology necessary to epistemology, or like kind of come to know before Descartes, or like does even Aristotelian like philosophy or like other philosophies like predate Cartesian require kind of phenomenology in order to do that correctly? Even if phenomenology can't do everything that other systems.
I see what you're saying. I think phenomenology always will help us get to the truth. And if there had been this like phenomenology and metaphysics are developing at the same time, that would have been great. It didn't quite happen that way. So there's that. I also think though that because we're limited creatures bound by time and space, like we can't really just pursue all of truth all at once. And so it kind of comes in waves. And I think right now we're in kind of a phenomenological wave. This is my now I'm just, saying my thoughts. And that there are other key moments in history. Like I think for Athens, post whatever tragedy, brought them, like the post-Trojan War, whatever brought them to the climate when Socrates started speaking. I think they needed that kind of activity, and it was akin to phenomenology that Socrates was doing. And so I think there are key moments in history when it's more useful and more needed. Yeah.
Maybe just one more question.
Okay. Dr. Easting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was intriguing. A potential critique of Descartes is that he's simply trying, he just wants too much certainty. He's just too greedy for certainty, and this methodology is designed to get to a trans-Euclidean certainty that is just not attainable for human beings. Would a phenomenologist take that line of attack, or would they critique it?
Not a good one. Yeah. If the phenomenologist is taking into account the foundations of the science that Husserl lays out, he would no longer be pursuing phenomenology if he asserted it as dogmatic. If he asserted that it was replacing metaphysics, that doesn't quite make sense, because he's saying that our experiences are prior to being, and this gets back to the Cartesian denial of the world about him, that it's not something that you prove, it's something that you know. And so phenomenology notices this reality and says it out loud, but it wouldn't replace metaphysics. So I think that phenomenologist should be called out. He's doing that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.